For the next 30 days, this indoor Phalaenopsis orchid is going to live outside on a shaded patio. The move could give it brighter light, better airflow, and a more natural summer environment. It could also expose the plant to burned leaves, rapid dehydration, trapped rainwater, strong wind, and pests that were never part of its indoor routine. By the end of this test, I want to answer a simple question. Can you safely put an orchid outside in summer, or are the risks greater than the potential benefits? The answer is not as simple as yes or no. An orchid does not respond to a place called outside. It responds to light, temperature, humidity, wind, rain, potting mix, drainage, and the way its owner reacts to changing conditions. A shaded patio may be an excellent summer growing space for one orchid and a dangerous location for another. Even two patios in the same neighborhood can create completely different conditions. Before moving this orchid, I needed to establish a healthy starting point. This plant had firm green leaves, a clean central crown, and a visible root system inside a transparent nursery pot. The roots were mostly silver when dry and became greener after watering. The potting medium was orchid bark, and the pot had enough drainage holes to let excess water escape. I also checked the plant carefully for existing problems. I looked at the upper and lower surfaces of every leaf. I checked the joints where the leaves meet the stem. I examined the crown, the flower spike, the bark surface, the sides of the clear pot, and the drainage holes. I was looking for white cottony clusters, sticky residue, raised brown scale, pale speckling, fine webbing, chewed areas, slime trails, and insects hiding near the base of the plant. This step matters because a problem that already exists indoors should not later be blamed on the outdoor environment. A plant with active root rot, severe dehydration, crown damage, or a serious pest infestation is not a good candidate for an outdoor experiment. Moving a struggling orchid into a more variable environment may add stress when the plant needs stability. The crown also deserved special attention. The crown is the central point where the newest leaves emerge. It should be clean, firm, and free from trapped water or soft, dark tissue. Phalaenopsis orchids can get wet, but water that remains trapped in the crown for too long can create a serious problem. Outside, a brief shower can fill that area when no one is watching, so the crown must remain part of every inspection. Next, I looked through the transparent pot. Healthy Phalaenopsis roots often appear silver, grey-green, or pale when dry. After watering, many of them become a deeper green. That color change does not mean a new root has appeared. It simply means the outer layer of the existing root has absorbed water. A genuinely growing root usually has a smooth, active tip that looks brighter and slightly different from the older section behind it. I noted the visible root tips before the test, so I could compare the same areas later without removing the orchid from its pot. I did not unpot the plant just to create a dramatic root inspection. Pulling a stable orchid out of its container would introduce unnecessary disturbance and make the outdoor comparison less useful. The transparent pot already provided enough information about root color, moisture, and visible growth. I also paid attention to the potting mix. This orchid was growing in bark, but many grocery store orchids are packed in sphagnum moss or in a combination of bark and moss. Those materials do not dry at the same speed. Coarse bark can lose moisture quickly in warm, moving air. Dense moss may remain wet deep in the pot long after the surface feels dry. A bark and moss mixture can create wet and dry zones inside the same container. That is why the type of potting medium changes the way an orchid must be managed outside. The decorative outer pot was another possible risk. Indoors, a decorative container may catch a little runoff after watering. Outside, it can collect rainwater around the clear nursery pot. If the orchid sits in that water, the roots can remain wet even while the leaves are surrounded by fresh air. Good airflow around the top of the plant cannot compensate for roots sitting in stagnant water. Before moving the orchid, I also observed how the pot normally dried indoors. I noticed its weight after watering and compared that with its weight as the bark dried. I looked at the roots, condensation inside the pot, and moisture deeper in the bark. The exact number of days between waterings was less important than understanding the pattern. Without that indoor baseline, I would not know whether the patio was making the pot dry faster, stay wet longer, or become less predictable. Only after inspecting the plant did I begin evaluating the patio. At first glance, the selected area looked shaded, but a location that is shaded in the morning is not automatically safe throughout the day. The sun moves, reflections change. Walls, windows, concrete, brick, and metal can absorb or redirect heat. A narrow beam of direct sunlight may reach the orchid for a short time in the afternoon and disappear before anyone notices. That short exposure can still be enough to damage a leaf that has spent months growing in gentle indoor light. I checked the patio in the morning, around midday, and later in the afternoon. I watched where the shadows moved. I checked whether sunlight reflected from a glass door or a pale wall. I noticed whether the floor became hot and whether wind was being funneled through the space. I also looked for areas where rain could blow under the roof. The orchid did not begin at the bright outer edge of the patio. I placed it deeper inside, where the light was bright but filtered and where direct afternoon sun could not reach the leaves. Bright shade should not mean darkness. An orchid still needs useful light. The goal is to provide a brighter environment than a dim indoor corner without suddenly exposing the plant to harsh summer sun. For the first stage of the test, I was not looking for new growth. I was looking for successful acclimation. Could the orchid maintain firm leaves? Could the roots move through a normal wet and dry cycle? Could the plant tolerate the new airflow and temperature without changing color or losing moisture too quickly? Those questions mattered more than whether a new root appeared during the first few days. There is no single acclimation schedule that works for every orchid in every part of the United States. A humid, shaded porch in Florida is different from a hot, dry balcony in Arizona. A mild patio in the Pacific Northwest is different from a windy terrace in the Midwest. Instead of following a universal schedule, I watched the plant and the actual conditions. During the early part of the test, I checked the leaves more frequently than usual. I gently felt the upper surfaces to see whether they were becoming unusually warm. A slightly warm leaf is not automatically damaged, but a hot leaf in brighter than expected light is a warning. I also looked for changes in color. Early light stress may appear as rapid paling, a yellow-green area, a bleached patch, or a section that looks different from the surrounding tissue. A dry brown mark is usually a later sign. By the time a burn has become dark and obvious, the damaging exposure has already occurred. That is why waiting for a brown spot is not a good way to test whether a location is safe. If the leaves become hot or begin changing color quickly, the orchid should be moved into deeper shade immediately. It does not need extra fertilizer. It does not need to be sprayed with water and left under the same strong light. It needs a safer environment. Fertilizer cannot reverse sun damage, and adding more nutrients to a stressed plant does not correct excessive light. If a leaf develops a burned area, I do not automatically remove the entire leaf. The damaged tissue will not turn green again, but the healthy portion of the leaf may continue supporting the orchid. A cosmetic scar is not a reason to remove useful tissue. Trimming becomes necessary only when there is spreading rot, severe physical damage, or another problem that requires sanitary removal. Temperature differences also became important. Moving an orchid repeatedly from strong air conditioning into very hot outdoor air can create additional stress. The plant is not only adjusting to brighter light, it is also experiencing changes in temperature, humidity, and air movement. I tried to keep the transition as stable as possible. If the forecast called for extreme heat, a cold, wet night, a strong storm, or damaging wind, protecting the plant was more important than forcing it to remain outside for the sake of completing a perfect calendar. A safe test should respond to real conditions. It should never sacrifice the plant just to say it remained outdoors continuously for 30 days. As the orchid became accustomed to the patio, the next major issue was not the leaves, it was the pot. The pot did not dry in exactly the same way it had dried indoors. Outside, warm, moving air can pull moisture from the bark quickly. A small, clear pot may become light sooner than expected. Exposed roots may turn silver rapidly, especially when the humidity is low or the wind increases. But outdoor conditions do not always make an orchid dry faster. High humidity can slow water loss. Rain can saturate the bark. Dense moss in the center can stay wet. A decorative pot or saucer can trap water around the drainage holes. This creates an important contradiction. The bark on the surface may look dry while the center is still moist. At the same time, a few exposed roots may look silver, even though the roots inside the pot still have enough water. That is why I stopped relying on the old indoor watering schedule. A watering interval that worked beside a window was only a reference. It was not a rule for the patio. Before watering, I checked several signs together. I looked at the color of the accessible roots. I lifted the pot to feel its weight. I checked for condensation inside the clear plastic. I examined moisture deeper in the bark instead of touching only the surface. No single sign was perfect, but several signs together gave a much more reliable picture. The goal was not to keep every root bright green all the time. Healthy orchid roots naturally move between wetter and drier states. Constantly watering every time an aerial root looks silver can keep the center of the pot unnecessarily wet. When the orchid genuinely needed water, I watered the bark thoroughly and allowed all excess water to drain. I did not leave the inner pot sitting in runoff. I checked the decorative container and emptied any collected water. I also made sure that bark, debris, or the angle of the pot had not blocked a drainage hole. Rain introduced another challenge. A light shower might wet the leaves and only the upper layer of bark. A longer rain could soak the entire pot. Looking at the weather alone did not tell me whether the orchid had received enough water or too much. After rain, I still checked the root color, the weight of the pot, the bark, and the center of the plant. The crown required immediate attention. If water remained between the newest leaves, I removed it gently and moved the orchid to a protected place with good airflow. I did not put the wet plant in direct sun to dry it faster. Strong light and heat can create a second source of stress. The safer combination was shade, airflow, and enough time for the water to evaporate without overheating the leaves. Rain itself is not automatically harmful to orchids. Orchids in nature get wet. The danger comes when water remains trapped in sensitive areas or when the potting mix stays saturated without enough warmth and airflow to dry safely. This is why a covered patio is often easier to manage than an exposed location. It allows the grower to control watering instead of allowing every storm to make the decision. By the middle of the test, the biggest lesson was already becoming clear. The indoor routine could not simply be moved outside with the orchid. The plant's needs changed with cloud cover, wind, rain, humidity, and temperature. A fixed calendar could not respond to those variables. Observation was more useful than routine. Some days, the bark lost moisture faster because the air was warm and moving. On more humid days, the same pot remained damp longer. This did not mean the plant was unpredictable. It meant the environment was changing, and the watering decisions had to change with it. Fertilizer also needed to remain secondary. The patio was not a reason to feed the orchid more aggressively. If the roots were overheated, extremely dry, or damaged, a strong fertilizer solution could make the situation worse. Water, drainage, and root health came first. When the plant was stable and actively growing, a properly diluted orchid fertilizer could be used according to the product directions. Periodic flushing with clean water could help prevent mineral salts from building up in the bark. More fertilizer was not the answer to every slow-growing root or pale leaf. Outside, airflow was generally stronger than it had been indoors. Gentle airflow can be helpful. It helps wet leaf surfaces dry and reduces stagnant conditions around the pot. Strong wind is different. A gust can tip over a lightweight orchid pot, whip a flower spike, scrape leaves against a railing, and cause moisture to disappear much faster than expected. I placed the orchid on a stable surface where it could receive air movement without being exposed to damaging wind. If an outer container was used for support, it still needed to allow drainage. It could not become a reservoir of rainwater. The orchid also needed to remain easy to lift and inspect. Securing a plant so tightly that the leaves are crushed or the pot cannot be removed creates a different problem. As the days passed, I added pest inspection to the daily routine. An orchid that has lived indoors may have limited contact with crawling insects. Outside, Ants, slugs, snails, aphids, mealybugs, scale insects, and mites may reach the plant or hide around the pot. Not every insect on a patio is harmful to orchids. The correct response is identification, not panic. I inspected the undersides of the leaves, the joints between the leaves and the stem, the crown, the bark surface, the flower spike, the pot walls, and the drainage holes. I looked for white cottony material, sticky residue, raised brown shells, fine webbing, pale stippling, chewed edges, slime trails, and ants repeatedly entering the bark. From above, an orchid may look perfectly clean, while a pest is hiding under a leaf or near the bottom of the pot. I did not spray strong chemicals simply because the plant had been outdoors. Preventive overtreatment can damage the orchid, expose people and pets unnecessarily, and make it more difficult to identify the real problem. If a pest is found, the better approach is to isolate the orchid, identify the pest, and use a treatment appropriate to that specific situation. One clean inspection does not guarantee that the plant is free from eggs or tiny insects. Repeated checks are more valuable. This was the turning point of the experiment. The original question sounded simple. Can an orchid go outside in summer? But the orchid was not reacting to one condition called outside. It was reacting to a combination of light, heat, airflow, humidity, rain, wind, drainage, potting mix, and pests. The conditions that could help the plant grow were also the conditions that could damage it if they were misunderstood. A brighter environment could support growth, but direct afternoon sun could burn a leaf. Airflow could help the plant dry, but strong wind could dehydrate it or knock it over. Rain could water the bark, but it could also fill the crown or leave the roots wet for too long. The outdoor environment was not automatically better or worse than the indoor environment. It was simply less controlled. That meant the success of the test depended on how carefully the plant was observed and how quickly the placement was adjusted. During the final part of the month, I kept the environment as stable as possible. I did not move the orchid towards stronger light simply to create a dramatic result. I did not increase fertilizer to force visible growth. I did not unpot the plant to search for a transformation. The purpose was to learn whether a normal indoor Phalaenopsis could remain healthy on a shaded patio when the transition was managed carefully. Different orchid types may respond differently. Cattleyas, vandas, dendrobiums, and cymbidiums may tolerate or require more light than a typical Phalaenopsis. Their temperature preferences and watering needs may also be different. A location that works for a highlight orchid should not automatically be used for a moth orchid. The correct placement depends on the specific orchid, its previous growing conditions, and the local climate. The height of the plant above the patio floor also mattered. A pot placed directly on the ground is easier for slugs, snails, ants, and splashing debris to reach. The floor may also become hotter than the air above it. Raising the orchid on a stable, open shelf can improve drainage and make inspections easier. However, a higher position may receive stronger wind or more light, so the new location still needs to be evaluated. Every improvement can create another variable if it is made without observation. Nighttime conditions were just as important as daytime sunlight. A warm afternoon does not guarantee a safe night. An exposed balcony may cool more quickly than a sheltered patio. Wind and rain can make a cool night more stressful, especially when the plant remains wet. Phalaenopsis orchids generally prefer warm conditions. A cold, wet night is not a useful challenge. It is a reason to move the plant into a protected location. The citywide forecast is helpful, but the actual microclimate around the orchid matters more. A wall can hold heat, a balcony can funnel wind, a covered corner can remain humid, a concrete floor can stay warm after sunset. The plant experiences the conditions at its exact location, not the number shown on a weather app. A short daily check became more valuable than a long inspection performed after damage appeared. I began with the leaves. Were they still firm? Had the color changed? Was one side becoming lighter than the other? Next, I checked the crown for trapped water. Then I lifted the pot and noticed whether its weight had changed. I looked through the clear sides for root color, moisture, and condensation. Finally, I checked under at least one leaf and around the drainage holes. The entire process took only a few minutes, but it could reveal a changing pattern before the plant developed severe stress. Frequent observation does not mean treating every small change as an emergency. A root changing from green to silver as it dries is normal. A leaf moving slightly as hydration changes is not automatically a crisis. A harmless insect landing on a flower does not prove the plant is infested. The purpose of observation is to recognize trends. Repeated overheating, progressive yellowing, bark that never dries, roots losing firmness, and pests appearing in protected areas are trends that require action. When a problem appeared possible, I changed the most likely cause first. If the leaves were becoming too warm, I moved the plant into deeper shade. If the pot stayed wet too long, I corrected the drainage and protected it from rain. If wind was making the plant unstable, I moved it to a more sheltered surface. Changing light, water, fertilizer, potting mix, and temperature all at the same time would make it impossible to understand what helped. Repotting also remained a last resort. A stable orchid should not be pulled apart in the middle of an outdoor experiment without a real reason. Repotting becomes necessary when the medium is decomposed, the root system is failing, drainage is blocked, or an active problem cannot be managed in the existing pot. Otherwise, the clear container provides useful information without disturbing healthy roots. If an emergency does require repotting, the outdoor test is no longer a clean comparison, and the conclusion must acknowledge that. By the end of the month, I could divide outdoor orchid locations into 3 practical categories. The first was a lower risk zone. This was a bright shaded area under a roof or overhang, protected from direct afternoon sun, with gentle airflow, free drainage, and easy access for daily checks. The second was a caution zone. This area had shifting sunlight, occasional rain, warmer reflected surfaces, or moderate wind. An orchid might remain there safely, but the placement would need frequent monitoring and adjustment. The third was a high-risk zone. This included exposed west-facing sun, hot glass or metal nearby, standing water, strong gusts, uncontrolled rain, and locations that could not be inspected regularly. A patio may contain all 3 zones only a few feet apart. That is why simply saying the orchid is on a shaded patio does not provide enough information. At day 30, the most honest result was not a dramatic transformation. The orchid had remained stable because the environment was adjusted whenever the conditions changed. The leaves stayed firm, and there was no major sunburn. The crown remained healthy because it was checked after watering and rain. The roots continued moving through normal wet and dry cycles, and the clear pot made it possible to monitor them without disturbing the plant. The orchid did not suddenly produce a huge display of flowers, and that was never the purpose of the test. 30 days is a short period in the life of a Phalaenopsis. The more meaningful result was that the plant could remain outside without serious damage when the light, water, airflow, and weather were managed carefully. The outdoor placement also made the risks easier to understand. The biggest danger was not one dramatic event. It was the possibility of using an indoor routine in an environment that changed from day to day. Watering by the calendar could have left the center of the pot too wet after humid weather. Assuming all shade was safe could have exposed a leaf to a moving patch of afternoon sun. Ignoring the crown after rain could have allowed water to remain trapped. Skipping pest checks could have brought unwanted insects into the home. The test did not prove that every orchid should spend summer outside. It showed that a healthy Phalaenopsis can sometimes be moved outdoors safely when the transition is gradual and the location is controlled. The result applies to this type of orchid in a protected environment. It should not be copied blindly in a different climate, potting mix, or patio. The final step began before the orchid returned to its indoor growing area. I did not carry it directly inside and place it beside the other plants. First, I inspected every leaf in good light. I checked the upper and lower surfaces, the leaf joints, the crown, the base of the plant, the flower spike, the bark, the stake, the clips, the sides of the pot, and the drainage holes. I looked underneath the pot and inside the decorative container. Slugs, snails, ants, mealybugs, and scale insects can hide in small protected spaces that are easy to overlook. I cleaned the outside of the pot and removed loose debris. If a pest had been found, the orchid would have remained isolated and would have been treated before entering the indoor collection. Even when no obvious pest was visible, keeping the plant separate for an observation period was the safer choice. One inspection cannot reveal every egg or tiny insect. The return indoors also created another environmental change. The patio had been brighter and more open than the indoor location. Moving the plant back inside meant the pot might begin drying more slowly again. The outdoor watering routine had to end when the plant came indoors. I returned to checking the roots, bark, and pot weight under indoor conditions instead of continuing the schedule that had developed on the patio. So, can you put an orchid outside in summer? In some conditions, yes. A healthy Phalaenopsis may spend part of the summer outdoors when it is acclimated gradually, protected from harsh direct sun, kept in a freely draining pot, monitored after rain, sheltered from strong wind, and inspected regularly for pests. But outside is not a complete care instruction. Before moving your orchid, ask 5 questions. Is the plant healthy enough to handle a change? Does the location provide stable, bright shade instead of surprise direct sunlight? Can the pot drain and dry safely after watering or rain? Can the plant be protected from extreme heat, cold nights, and strong wind? And can you inspect it often enough to catch a problem before it becomes serious? If the answer to any of these questions is no, keeping the orchid indoors is not a failure. A bright indoor window with appropriate care may be much safer than an unpredictable patio. The goal is not to copy someone else's 30-day experiment. The goal is to understand the conditions around your own orchid. The real question is not simply whether an orchid can live outside in summer. The better question is whether your orchid, your patio, your weather, your potting mix, and your watering habits can work together safely. Begin in the most protected bright shade you can provide. Change only one condition at a time. Watch the light as the sun moves. Check the center of the pot before watering. Keep water from remaining in the crown. Protect the plant from damaging wind and rain. Inspect it carefully before bringing it back indoors. Most importantly, let the roots and leaves tell you what the orchid needs. Do not let a fixed calendar make the decision for you.